Good morning, boys and girls. I hope you are having a fantastic day. We are going to go ahead and record the read aloud. Um, this group is reading Wrinkle in Time. I'm just going to continue off reading from where we were the other day. I'll switch the camera so you guys can look at the words with me if you'd like, or you can just think about the story as we read. And then we will do the student notebook, and then I'll give you the rest of your directions. So make sure you're doing your best for the sub today. I will be checking in later. Want to see a top dogs? It's kind of got a glare, but that's what that says there. And yeah, let me switch the camera here. Okay. Charles Wallace looked at Calvin probingly for the moment. Then an almost glazed look came into his eyes, and he seemed to be thinking at him. Calvin stood very still and waited. At last, Charles Wallace said, "Okay, I believe you, but I can't tell you. I think I'd like to trust you. Maybe you'd better come home with us and have a dinner." "Well, sure, but what would your mother say to that?" Calvin asked. "She'd be delighted. Mother's all right. She's not one of us, but she's all right." "What about Meg?" "Meg has it tough," Charles Wallace said. "She's not really one thing or the other." "What do you mean one of us?" Meg demanded. "What do you mean I'm not one thing or the other?" "Not now, Meg," Charles Wallace said. "Slowly. I'll tell you about it later." He looked at Calvin, then seemed to make a quick decision. "Okay, let's take him to meet Mrs. Whatsit. If he's not okay, she'll know." He started off on his short legs toward the dilapidated old house. The haunted house was half in the shadows of the clump of elms in which it stood. The elms were almost bare now, and the ground around the house was yellow with damp leaves. The late afternoon light had a greenish cast which the blank windows reflected in a sinister way. An unhinged shutter thumped. Something else cracked. Meg did not wonder that the house had a reputation for being haunted. A board was nailed across the front door, but Charles Wallace led the way around to the back. The door there appeared to be nailed shut too, but Charles Wallace knocked, and the door swung slowly outward, creaking on rusty hinges. Up in one of the elms, an old black crow gave its raucous cry, and a woodpecker went into a wild rat-a-tat-tat. A large gray rat scuttled around the corner of the house, and Meg let out a stifled shriek. They get a lot of fun out of using all those special props. They get a lot of fun out of using all the typical props, Charles Wallace said in a reassuring voice. "Come on, follow me." Calvin put a strong hand to Meg's elbow, and Fort pressed against her leg. Happiness at their concern was so strong in her that her panic fled, and she followed Charles Wallace into the dark recesses of the house without fear. They'd entered into a sort of a kitchen. There was a huge fireplace with a big black pot hanging over a merry fire. Why had there been no smoke visible from the chimney? Something in the pot was bubbling, and it smelled more like one of Mrs. Murray's chemical messes than something to eat. In a dilapidated Boston rocker sat a plump little woman. She wasn't Mrs. Whatsit, so she must, Meg decided, be one of Mrs. Whatsit's two friends. She wore enormous spectacles, twice as thick and twice as large as Meg's, and she was sewing busily with rapid jabbing stitches on a sheet. Several other sheets lay on the dusty floor. Spectacles, by the way, so you reader know, are a type of glasses. So, and when she says thick, she means this way. So you can see if you actually look at mine, mine are thinner on this side than they are on this side. You can see this is thicker here than this one is here. So hers are really thick. Charles Wallace went up to her. "I really don't think you ought to have taken Mrs. Buncombe's sheets without consulting me," he said, as cross and bossy as only a very small boy can be. "What on earth do you want them for?" The plump little woman beamed at him. "Why, Charlesy, my pet, la cour a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît point. French, Pascal. The heart has its reasons whereof reason knows nothing." "But that's not appropriate at all," Charles said crossly. "Your mother would find it so." A smile seemed to gleam through the roundness of spectacles. "I'm not talking about my mother's feelings about my father," Charles Wallace scolded. "I'm talking about Mrs. Buncombe's sheets." The little woman sighed, and the enormous glasses caught the light again and shone like an owl's eyes. In case we need ghosts, of course, she said. I should think you have guessed. If we have to frighten anybody away, what's it thought we ought to do it appropriately. That's why it's so much fun to stay in a haunted house. But we really didn't mean you to know about the sheets. Auf Friser tat etrap, German. In flagrat delicato, Latin. Caught in the act. English, as I was saying. But Charles Wallace held up his hand in a peremptory gesture. Mrs. Who, do you know this boy? Calvin bowed. Good afternoon, ma'am. I didn't quite catch your name. Mrs. Who will do, the woman said. He wasn't my idea, Charlesy, but I think he's a good one. Where's Mrs. Whatsit? Charles asked. She's busy. It's getting near time, Charlesy. Getting near time. Ab honesto virvum bonum nihil direct. Seneca. Nothing deters a good man from doing what is honorable. And he is a very good man, Charlesy, darling. But right now he needs our help. Who? Meg demanded. And little Megsy. Lovely to meet you, sweetheart. Your father, of course. Now go home, loves. The time is not yet ripe. Don't worry, we won't go without you. Get plenty of food and rest. Feed Calvin up. Now off with you. Justice soir fides. Latin again, of course. Faith is the sister of justice. Trust in us. Now shoo! And she fluttered up from her chair and pushed them out the door with surprising power. Charles, Meg said, I don't understand. Charles took her by the hand and dragged her away from the house. Fortinbras ran on ahead, and Calvin was close behind them. No, he said, I don't either. Yet. Not quite. I'll tell you what I know as soon as I can. But you saw Fort, didn't you? Not a growl, not a quiver, just as though there weren't anything strange about it. So you know it's okay. Look, do me a favor, both of you. Let's not talk about it till we've had something to eat. I need fuel so I can sort things out and assimilate them properly. Lead on, moron, Calvin cried gaily. I've never even seen your house. I have the funniest feeling that for the first time in my life, I'm going home. Mrs. Witch. In the forest, evening was already beginning to fall, and they walked in silence. Charles and Fortinbras gamboled ahead. Calvin walked with Meg, his fingers barely touching her arm in a protective gesture. This had been the most impossible, the most confusing afternoon of my life, she thought. Yet I don't feel confused or upset any more. I only feel happy. Why? Maybe we weren't meant to meet before this, Calvin said. I mean, I knew who you were in school and everything, but I didn't know you. But I'm glad we've met now, Meg. We're going to be friends, you know. I'm glad too, Meg whispered, and they were silent again. When they got back to the house, Mrs. Murray was still in the lab. She was watching a pale blue fluid move slowly through a tube from a beaker to a retort. Over a Bunsen burner bubbled a big earthen dish of stew. Don't tell Sandy and Dennis I'm cooking out here, she said. They're always suspicious that a few chemicals might get in with the meat. But I've had an experiment I wanted to stay with. This is Calvin O'Keefe, Mother, Meg said. Is there enough for him too? It smells super. Hello, Calvin. Mrs. Murray shook hands with him. Nice to meet you. We aren't having anything but stew tonight, but it's a good thick one. Sounds wonderful to me, Calvin said. May I use your phone so my mother will know where I am? Of course. Show him where it is, will you please, Meg? I won't ask you to use the one out here, if you don't mind. I'd like to finish up this experiment. Meg led the way into the house. Charles Wallace and Fortinbras had gone off. Outdoors, she could hear Sandy and Dennis hammering at the fort they were building up in one of the maples. This way, Meg went through the kitchen and into the living room. I don't know why I call her when when I don't come home, Calvin said, his voice bitter. She won't notice. He sighed and dialed. Ma, he said. Oh, Hinky, tell Ma I won't be home till late. Nah, now don't forget, I don't want you to be locked out again. I don't want to be locked out again. He hung up, looked at Meg. Do you know how lucky you are? She smiled rather wryly. Not most of the time. A mother like that, a house like this, gee, your mother's gorgeous. You should see my mother. She had all her upper teeth out, and Pop got her a plate, but she won't wear it. And most days she doesn't even comb her hair. Not that it makes much a difference when she does. He clenched his fist. But I love her. That's the funny part of it. I love them all, and they don't give a hoot about me. Maybe that's why I call them when I'm not coming home, because I care. Nobody else does. You don't know how lucky you are to be loved. Meg said in a startled way, I guess I never thought of that. I guess I just took it for granted. Calvin looked somber. Then his enormous smile lit up his face again. Things are going to happen, Meg. Good things. I feel it. He began wandering, still slowly, around the pleasant, if shabby, living room. He stopped before a picture on the piano of a small group of men standing together on a bench. Who's this? Oh, a bunch of scientists. Where? Meg went over to the picture. Cape Canaveral. This one's father. Which? Here. The one with the glasses? Yep, the one who needs a haircut. Meg giggled, forgetting her worries in her pleasure at showing Calvin the picture. His hair's sort of his hair's sort of the same color as mine, and he keeps forgetting to have it cut. Mother usually ends up doing it for him. She bought clippers and stuff because he won't take the time to go to the barber. Calvin studied the picture. I like him, he announced judiciously. Looks kind of like Charles Wallace, doesn't he? Meg laughed again. When Charles was a baby, he looked exactly like father. It was really funny. Calvin continued to look at the picture. He's not handsome or anything, but I like him. Meg was indignant. He is too handsome. Calvin shook his head. Nah, he's tall and skinny like me. Well, I think you're handsome, Meg said. Father's eyes are kind of like yours too, really blue, only you don't notice his as much because of the glasses. Where is he now? Meg stiffened, but as she didn't have to answer because the door from the lab to the kitchen slammed, and Mrs. Murray came in carrying a dish of stew. Now, she called, I'll finish this up properly on the stove. Have you done your homework, Meg? Not quite, Meg said, going back into the kitchen. Then I'm sure Calvin won't mind if you finish before dinner. Sure, go ahead. Calvin fished in his pocket and pulled out a wad of folded paper. As a matter of fact, I have some junk of mine to finish up. Math. That's one thing I have a hard time keeping up in. I'm okay on anything to do with words, but I don't do well with numbers. Mrs. Murray smiled. Why don't you get Meg to help you? But see, I'm several grades above Meg. Try asking her to help you with your math anyhow, Mrs. Murray suggested. Well, sure. Here. But it's pretty complicated. Meg smoothed out the paper and studied it. Do they care how you do it? She asked. I mean, can you work it out your own way? Well, sure, as long as I understand and get the answers right. Well, we have to do it their way. Now look, Calvin, don't you see how much easier it would be if you did it this way? Her pencil flew over the paper. Hey, Calvin said. Hey, I think I get it. Show me once more on another one. Again, Meg's pencil was busy. All you have to remember is that every ordinary fraction can be converted into an infinite periodic decimal fraction. See? So 3/7 is 0.428571. This is the craziest family, Calvin grinned at her. I suppose I should stop being surprised by now, but you're supposed to be dumb in school, always being called up on the carpet. Oh, I am. The trouble with Meg and math, Mrs. Murray said briskly, is that Meg and her father used to play with numbers, and Meg learned far too many shortcuts. So when they want her to do problems the long way around at school, she gets sullen and stubborn and sets up a fine mental block for herself. Are there any more morons like Meg and Charles around? Calvin asked. If so, I should like to meet more of them. It might help if Meg's handwriting were legible, Mrs. Murray said. With a good deal of difficulty, I can usually decipher it, but I doubt very much if her teachers can or are willing to take the time. I'm planning on giving her a typewriter for Christmas. That may help. That might be a help. If I get anything right, nobody will believe it's me, Meg said. What's a mark? What's a megaparsec? Calvin asked. One of Father's nicknames for me, Meg said. It's also 3.26 million light years. What's E equal mc squared? Einstein's equation. What's the E stand for? Energy, m, mass, c squared. The square of the velocity of light in centimeters per second. By what countries is Peru bounded? I haven't the faintest idea. I think it's in South America somewhere. What's the capital of New York? Well, New York City, of course. Who wrote Boswell's Life of Johnson? Oh, Calvin, I'm not any good at English. Calvin groaned and turned to Mrs. Murray. I see what you mean. Her I wouldn't want to teach. She's a little one-sided, I grant you, Mrs. Murray said, though I blame her father and myself for that. She still enjoyed playing with her dolls, though. Mother! Meg shrieked in agony. Oh, darling, I'm sorry, Mrs. Murray said swiftly, but I'm sure Calvin understands what I mean. With a sudden enthusiastic gesture, Calvin flung his arms out wide, as though he were embracing Meg and her mother, the whole house. How did all this happen? Isn't it wonderful? I feel as though I was just being born. I'm not alone anymore. Do you realize what this means to me? But you're good at basketball and things, Meg protested. You're good in school. Everybody likes you. For all the most unimportant reasons, Calvin said. There hasn't been anybody in the world I could talk to. Sure, I can function on the same level as everybody else. I can hold myself down, but it isn't me. Meg took a batch of forks from the drawer and turned them over and over, looking at them. I'm all confused again. Oh, so am I, Calvin said. But now at least I know we're going somewhere. Meg was pleased and a little surprised when the twins were excited at having Calvin for supper. They knew more about his athletic record and were far more impressed by it than she. Calvin ate 5 bowls of stew, 3 saucers of jello, and a dozen cookies, and then Charles Wallace insisted that Calvin take him up to bed and read to him. The twins, who had finished their homework, were allowed to watch half an hour of TV. Meg helped her mother with the dishes and then sat at the table and struggled with her homework, but she could not concentrate. Mother, are you upset? She asked suddenly. Mrs. Murray looked up from her copy of an English scientific magazine through which she was leafing. Leafing means flipping through. For a moment she did not speak. Then, yes. Why? Again Mrs. Murray paused. She held her hands out and looked at them. They were long and strong and beautiful. She touched with the fingers of her right hand and the broad gold band on her third finger of her left hand. I'm still quite a young woman, you know, she said finally, though I realize that's difficult for you children to conceive. And I'm still very much in love with your father. I miss him quite dreadfully. And you think that has something to do with father? I think it must have. But what? That I don't know. But it seems the only explanation. Do you think things always have an explanation? Yes, I believe that they do. But I think that with our human limitations, we're not always able to understand the explanations. But you see, Meg, just because we don't understand doesn't mean that the explanation doesn't exist. I like to understand things, Meg said. We all do. But it isn't always possible. Charles Wallace understands more than the rest of us, doesn't he? Yes. Why? I suppose because he's different, Meg. Different how? I'm not quite sure. You know yourself he's not like anybody else. No, and I wouldn't want him to be, Meg said defensively. Wanting doesn't have anything to do with it. Charles Wallace is what he is. Different. New. New? Yes, that's what your father and I feel. Meg twisted her pencil so hard that it broke. She laughed. I'm sorry. I'm really not being destructive. I'm just trying to get things straight. I know. But Charles Wallace doesn't look different than anybody else. No, Meg, but people are more than just the way they look. Charles Wallace's difference isn't physical. It's in essence. Meg sighed heavily, took off her glasses and twirled them, put them back on again. Well, I know Charles Wallace is different, and I know he's something more. I guess I'll just have to accept it without understanding it. Mrs. Murray smiled at her. Maybe that's really the point I was trying to put across. Yeah, Meg said dubiously. Her mother smiled again. Maybe that's why our visitor last night didn't surprise me. Maybe that's why I'm able to have a willing suspension of disbelief, because Charles Wallace. Are you like Charles? Meg asked. I? Heavens no. I'm blessed with more brains and opportunities than many people, but there's nothing about me that breaks out of the ordinary mold. Your looks do, Meg said. Mrs. Murray laughed. You just haven't had enough basis for comparison, Meg. I'm very ordinary, really. Calvin O'Keefe coming in, then said, Ha ha. Charles, all settled? Mrs. Murray asked. Yes. What did you read to him? Genesis. His choice, by the way. What kind of experiment were you working on this afternoon, Mrs. Murray? Oh, something my husband and I were cooking up together. I don't want to be too far behind him when he gets back. Mother, Meg pursued, Charles says I'm not one thing or the other, not flesh nor fowl, nor good red herring. Oh, for crying out loud, Calvin said. You're Meg, aren't you? Come on, let's go for a walk. But Meg was still not satisfied. And what do you make of Calvin? She demanded of her mother. Mrs. Murray laughed. I don't want to make anything of Calvin. I like him very much, and I'm delighted he's found his way here. Mother, you were going to tell me about a tesseract. Yes. A troubled look came into Mrs. Murray's eyes. But not now, Meg. Not now. Go on, out for that walk with Calvin. I'm going to kiss Charles goodnight and then I have to see that the twins get to bed. Outdoors, the grass was wet with dew. The moon was halfway up and dimmed the stars for a great arc. Calvin reached out and took Meg's hand with a gesture that as simple and friendly as Charles Wallace. "Were you upsetting your mother?" he asked gently. "I don't think I was, but she's upset." "What about, father?" Calvin led Meg across the lawn. The shadows of the trees were long and twisted, and there was a heavy, sweet, autumnal smell to the air. Meg stumbled as the land sloped suddenly downhill, but Calvin's strong hand steadied her. They walked carefully across the twins' vegetable garden, picking their way through the rows of cabbages, beets, broccoli, pumpkins. Looming on their left were the tall stalks of corn. Ahead of them, a small apple orchard bounded by a stone wall, and beyond this, the woods through which they had walked that afternoon. Calvin led the way to the wall, and then sat there, his red hair shining silver in the moonlight, his body dappled with patterns from the tangle of branches. He reached up, pulled an apple off a gnarled limb, and handed it to Meg, then picked one for himself. "Tell me about your father." "He's a physicist." "Sure, we all know that. And he's supposed to have left your mother and gone off with some dame." Meg jerked up from the stone from which she was perched, but Calvin grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her back down. "Hold it, kid. I didn't say anything you hadn't already heard, did I?" "No," Meg said, but continued to pull away. "Let me go." "Come on, calm down. You know it isn't true. I know it isn't true. And how anybody, after one look at your mother, could believe any man could leave her for another woman just shows how far jealousy will make some people go, right?" "I guess so," Meg said, but her happiness had fled and she was back in a morose of anger and resentment. "Look," Calvin shook her gently, "I just want to get things straight. Sort out the facts from fiction. Your father's a physicist. That's a fact, yes?" "Yes." "He's a PhD several times over." "Yes." "Most of the time he works alone, but some of the time he was at the Institute for Higher Learning in Princeton, correct?" "Yes." "Then he did some work for the government, didn't he?" "Yes." "You take it from there. That's all I know." "That's about all I know, too," Meg said. "Maybe Mother knows more. I don't know. What he did was, well, is what they call classified. Top secret." "You mean?" "That's right. And you don't even have any idea what it was about?" Meg shook her head. "No, not really. Just an idea because of where he was." "Well, where?" "Out in New Mexico for a while. We were here with him there. We were with him there. And then he was in Florida at Cape Canaveral, and we were with him there too. And then he was going to be traveling a lot, so he came here." "You'd always had this house?" "Yes, but we used to live in it just in the summer." "And you don't know where your father was sent?" "No. At first we got lots of letters. Mother and father always wrote to each other every day. I think Mother still writes him every night. Every once in a while, the postmistress makes some kind of crack about all the letters. I suppose they think she's pursuing him or something," Calvin said rather bitterly. "They can't understand plain, ordinary love when they see it. Well, go on, what happened next?" "Nothing happened," Meg said. "That's the trouble." "Well, what about your father's letters?" "They just stopped coming." "You haven't heard anything at all?" "No," Meg said, "nothing." Her voice was heavy with misery. Silence fell between them, as tangible as the dark tree shadows that fell across their laps, and that now seemed to rest upon them as heavily as though they possessed immeasurable weight of their own. At last Calvin spoke in a dry, unemotional voice, not looking at Meg. "Do you think he could be dead?" Again Meg leaped up, and again Calvin pulled her down. "No! They'd have told us if he was dead. There's always a telegram or something. They always tell you." "What do they tell you?" Meg choked down a sob, managed to speak over it. "Oh, Calvin, Mother's tried and tried to find out. She's been down to Washington and everything, and all they say is that he is on a secret and dangerous mission, and she can be very proud of him, but he won't be able to communicate with us for a while, and they'll give us news as soon as they have it." "Meg, don't get mad, but do you think maybe they don't know?" A slow tear trickled down Meg's cheek. "That's what I'm afraid of." "Why don't you cry?" Calvin asked gently. "You're just crazy about your father, aren't you? Go ahead and cry. It'll do you good." Meg's voice came out, trembling over tears. "I cry much, too much. I should be like Mother. I should be able to control myself. Your mother's a completely different person, and she's a lot older than you are." "I wish I were a different person," Meg said shakily. "I hate myself." Calvin reached over and took off her glasses. Then he pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped her tears. This gesture of tenderness undid her completely, and she put her head down on her knees and sobbed. Calvin sat quietly beside her, every once in a while patting her head. "I'm sorry," she sobbed finally. "I'm terribly sorry. Now you'll hate me." "Oh, Meg, you are a moron," Calvin said. "Don't you know you're the nicest thing that's happened to me in a long time?" Meg raised her head, and moonlight shone on her tear-stained face. Without the glasses, her eyes were unexpectedly beautiful. "If Charles Wallace is a sport, then I think I'm a biological mistake." Moonlight flashed across her braces as she spoke. Now she was waiting to be contradicted, but Calvin said, "Do you know this is the first time I've seen you without your glasses?" "I'm blind as a bat without them. I'm nearsighted like father." "Well, you know what? You've got dreamboat eyes," Calvin said. "Listen, you go right on wearing your glasses. I don't think I want anyone else to see what gorgeous eyes you have." Meg smiled with pleasure. She could feel herself blushing, and she wondered if the blush would be visible in the moonlight. "Okay." Sorry. "Okay, hold it, you two." A voice came out of the shadows. Charles Wallace stepped into the moonlight. "I wasn't spying on you," he said quickly. "I hate to break things up, but this is it, kids. This is it." His voice quivered with excitement. "This is what?" Calvin asked. "We are going." "Going? Where?" Meg reached out and instinctively grabbed for Calvin's hand. "I don't know exactly," Charles Wallace said, "but I think it's to find father." Suddenly, two eyes seemed to spring at them out of the darkness. It was the moonlight striking on Mrs. Who's glasses. She was standing next to Charles Wallace, and how she managed to appear there a moment ago, there had been nothing but flickering shadows in the moonlight, Meg had no idea. She heard a sound behind her and turned around. There was Mrs. Whatsit scrambling over the wall. "My, but I wish there was no wind," Mrs. Whatsit said plaintively. "It's so difficult with all these clothes." She wore her outfit of the night before, rubber boots and all, with the addition of one of Mrs. Buncombe's sheets, which she had draped over her. As she slid off the wall, the sheet caught on a low branch and came off. The felt hat slipped over both eyes, and another branch plucked at the pink stole. "Oh dear," she sighed, "I shall never learn to manage." Mrs. Who wafted over to her, tiny feet scarcely seeming to touch the ground, the lenses of her glasses glittering. "Com te piccolo fallo amaro morso. Dante, what grievous pain a little fault doth give thee." With a claw-like hand, she pushed the hat up on Mrs. Whatsit's forehead, untangled the stole from the tree, and with a deft gesture took the sheet and folded it. "Oh, thank you," Mrs. Whatsit said. "You're so clever." "Anuncio, vejabo, sabe, mas que an potro. Perez. An old horse knows more than a young horse." "Just because your paltry few billion years," Mrs. Whatsit was staring indignantly with a sharp, strange voice cut in. "All right, girls, this is no time for bickery." "It's Miss Switch," Charles Wallace said. There was a faint gust of wind. The leaves shivered in it. The patterns of moonlight shifted, and a circle of silver, something shimmered, quivered, and the voice said, "I do not think I will materialize completely. I find it very tiring, and we have much to do." Dun, dun, dun. All right, I'm going to switch my camera back. There we go. So we are getting ready to read chapter 4, The Black Thing. But I'm going to end this video portion here, and then get my notebook out and do the next video for you guys. But I hope you enjoyed this chapter.